Welcome to Mr. Thorpe's GCSE revision for the unit B604 Equality. This follows the OCR specification for philosophy and ethics and is one of 4 units that is studied during the course. Now, the principle of equality basically means the state of being equal, especially in status, rights or opportunities. Prejudice. It basically comes from the mind, believing that some people are inferior or superior without even knowing them. This is something that's going to stop the principle from equality taking place. Secondly, discrimination is where you actually physically act. It's where you treat people unfairly because of, for example, their race, colour, gender, class or age, or any other things as well. The principle of equality does not mean everyone is the same. However, it does mean that everyone has access to medical treatment. It does mean everyone has access to jobs. It does mean everyone has access to vote. And it does mean everyone has access to education and freedom. Now, these are just 5 examples. But if you're talking about what equality really means, it means that all people have access to these different areas, plus other areas as well that I'm sure you could think of. The history of equality in the world is not particularly good. Around the world, inequality has existed and still exists. People have been treated unfairly because of a perceived difference that leads some people to believe that they are superior and others are inferior. There are a number of key areas where inequality has happened, and that's racism, homophobia, disability, sexism, ageism and poverty. So let's have a look at how actually inequality has happened in these key areas. So racism, if you look back in history, you see slavery. Black people weren't allowed to vote. They were given access to very, very poor jobs, poor housing, and suffered physical and verbal abuse, and in many cases death as well, simply because of the colour of their skin. Homophobia, it was against the law in the UK. Over the last 50 years has the law been changed that it wasn't punishable by prison, and again people suffered physical, verbal abuse. It was seen as unnatural, and in some cases you could even be locked up in an asylum if you exhibited these particular traits. Sexism. Women in the past were just seen as homemakers. They had no votes, no right to vote. They were seen as emotionally or intellectually weak. They can't get the jobs, or they couldn't get jobs, or if men were around they were given the jobs, and they often got and still get lower pay. Disability. If you're disabled today, not so much in the UK, but I'm sure in some areas it's still true, but certainly when you look around the world, if you're disabled, your access to education is going to be less, you're going to have less jobs, you're going to be on poor pay, you're going to be considered an inferior, and you're going to have no access or little access to certain buildings or places where other people can get to simply because of your disability. Ageism. As you get older, you tend to be ignored, you can't get jobs, you're seen as too old, you're inferior, possibly your access to medical treatment might be less because you're physically weaker, and you might even suffer poor housing because you can't fight the case to get proper housing, and you might just give up on that. Again, one really big one as well with areas of inequality is poverty. Millions of people around the world are dying of hunger and disease, although there's enough food to go around the world. They're also going to have no education or poor education, medical treatment or jobs, and ultimately die as a consequence of this level of inequality. Well, let's have a review of some of the things we've just looked at. So, there's some questions. Can you do these questions that I'm just about to show you? Define equality. Explain at least 3 types of inequality. Give an example or give examples of what equality is. Explain the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Explain how prejudice and discrimination leads to inequality. What you can do with those questions is then think about or try and answer them. Attitude towards gender. Discriminating against someone because of the basis of sex. If you look at the picture here, you'll see that obviously there was a time in the UK where women were voting or protesting because they had no votes. It was only in 1918 this act, women over the age of 31 got the right to vote, and in 1928 it was lowered to 21, and today obviously all people over the age of 18, male and female, can vote. Lower pay. There was an act in 1970 that ensured women and men were paid the same money for doing the same jobs. Unfortunately, although this is law, often it is still not the case where it actually is in reality. Certainly with women and jobs, if you think of the Second World War, women were often doing jobs that men used to do, but when the men came back, they had to go back into the homes while the men went back to the factories, and very often women struggled with this. The Sex Discrimination Act in 1975 made it illegal to discriminate against any person because of their gender, certainly in the area of work. In the past, women were expected to be at home to cook, clean, bring up children and look after her husband, and this was considered to be the traditional family. Some believe that women weren't clever enough to get involved with politics or get a job. They were certainly not seen as equal to men. Within Christianity as well, it could be argued that certain Christian teachings have encouraged the idea that women are the weaker sex, and this has come from the idea of, in the Garden of Eden, Eve was deceived by the snake and then gave some to Adam. And it's led some people to believe that women are less competent than men. And in the book of Genesis, it also talks about God creating Eve as a helper for Adam. And again, depending on how you see this, you could imply this, that men are in charge and women simply need to do as they're told. Different but equal. Men and women are clearly different. They're physiologically different. But in many ways they're equal, intellectually, emotionally and spiritually. So there are differences, we must acknowledge those, but we must also acknowledge that there needs to be equal treatment of the sexes in those key areas. What about Jesus and women? There's a story in the Bible that talks about a woman who was caught in adultery. The religious leaders brought her to Jesus, and the law stated, Jewish law, that she should be stoned to death. And all around in this particular story, everyone was picked up stones in readiness to stone her to death. And then Jesus said something to them. He said this: "He that is without sin, let him cast the first stone." And of course what happened is all the stones fell to the ground. They fell to the ground because everyone was acutely aware that they were far from perfect. Now this is obviously in the context of how Jesus treats women. And very often in those days women were second-class citizens, but Jesus sets an example to draw people back to their own sin and actually make no distinction between male and female. Jesus then turns to the woman and says, "Who is here to condemn you?" And she basically turns around and says, "No one." Jesus says, "Neither do I." It's clear that Jesus had an equal agenda when it came to the sexes, in terms of how he treated them and how he felt they should be treated. And this story emphasises that really clearly. Here's a time for review. So what you're going to do with these, it's up to you. You can hold it, pause it, and actually try and write these answers down in terms of when you see the questions, but they're based on the previous slide. So what you need to do is see if you can define sexism. Give 2 examples of how women in the past were treated unfairly. Explain how the story of Adam and Eve could be used to promote inequality. Use a quote from the Bible and explain how it could be used to promote equality. And also the last one, explain how the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery could be used to promote equality.